speakers.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so if we go back to 2018 or 2019, we remember models like BERT and TFI that were popular then. They had a very tiny context, like they were handling mostly like inputs of length 128 or 512. And then we had a couple of models. Last year, GPT was announced. It was like 32K context length, which was like very big at the time. But then there was like these other models with 100,000 context length. And yesterday we saw like million or even more context length. So this is like growing exponentially, you can say. I don't know where we'll go next, but the interest in having models that can handle longer context has been like growing rapidly. So what are the challenges, right? Like, is it just taking whatever your favorite model is and throwing like all the data you have at it, or are there like actually challenges in handling long context inputs? So one obvious thing, which we are all probably familiar with since we're familiar with transformers for the past couple of years, is they're very expensive. And the self-attention layer computational cost grows quadratically with input sequence length. So this is a well-known problem. And despite a lot of work in the area, it continues to be a significant challenge, like scaling just training transformers on longer inputs, because it's just the quadratic cost and there's no way to get around it currently. So just computational cost is expensive during training. Okay, let's say we manage to train it, but if you want to serve it, even then we have still the same computational cost problem. It's still fairly expensive. So this has received a lot of attention, and there have been like many architectures developed to handle this issue. Like we have a couple of works on showing like what kinds of sparse attention architectures are beneficial and have good approximation properties. In our work with Charlie in NeurIPS 2020, we had another work trying to do like fast nearest neighbor search techniques based on decision trees to improve the computational cost of transformers called Treeformer in iClear recently. So there's been like a lot of interest. Maybe if there is some time, I'll revisit some of these works towards the end of the talk. But today I want to talk about another problem. Like, let's say we have like all the GPUs we want and we can do all this computation. Is then there is like no issue for us? Like, can we just take all the GPUs and feed in these models like very long videos and ask all the questions we want? Does it work out of the box, or do we need to do anything special? So that's the generalization problem. And as we'll see, like vanilla LLMs don't do well on this problem, and we need some changes to make them actually behave well on longer inputs. So let's define this problem. Like, what is this long context generalization problem? It's fairly like a very simple problem. Like, let's say we want to train the model on shorter inputs, like let's say 2000 length inputs. But at the test time, we want to test it on longer inputs, like maybe million or more. That's the problem we care about, and we call it long context generalization problem. And this is a very particular kind of auto distribution problem, because your training distribution is on like very short sequences, but you're testing on much longer sequences. So what happens when we take a typical LLM and try to test it on longer inputs than what we saw during training? So here I have like a very simple model. It's a language model that's trained on C4. It doesn't have many parameters. It's like maybe like 100 million parameters. And I train it on 2000 sequence length. So that's the red line here. And it gets some perplexity, like let's say 3.1 log perplexity. And now during evaluation, I evaluated a bunch of sequence lengths, starting from all the way from 512 to 8000 here. And what we observe is for evaluation lengths below training length, the perplexity looks reasonable. Okay, short sequences are harder to predict, so perplexity is a bit higher. At 2000, you get the value what you train with. But once we cross the training sequence length, we see like perplexity increase dramatically. Like at 8000, it's like much more than what we see at the 2000 context length. So this is opposite behavior of what we expect, because longer contexts are generally easier to predict because you have a lot of prefix. So the model should be getting actually lower perplexity. But we see the opposite trend where actually giving longer inputs is making the model worse. Why is it the case? So, yeah.
So when you say like longer sequences messes up with the model, so in the training, so perplexity typically tells you how confident the model is when predicting the next sequence, right?
Yeah.
So does this translate well in tasks? Like say you have
Yeah.
a task with super long sequence.
Yeah, so we also have evals on like downstream tasks like narrative QA, where you like feed long prefix and ask questions about it. So this translates to downstream tasks as well, this behavior and perplexity.
So this is training on short sequence and passing on long sequence.
Exactly. So that's the problem, like long context problem we care about. Yeah, so why is this happening, right? Like, you may wonder, maybe this is like specific property of natural language data. So here we have another plot from this paper, nice paper from Anil et al., where they test like pre-trained language models of different sizes on a very simple task, parity task, which we are all very familiar with, where we have a sequence of zeros and ones, and we need to predict the parity. That's the output. That's a very simple task. And what they do is they train with sequence length from 10 to 20. That's their training sequence length. But when they take the trained model, they evaluate it up to sequence 40. And as you can see on training, it's like perfect because it's a very simple task for these models. You get perfect accuracy. But as you increase the sequence length, you see like dramatic drop. Even so for larger models, like there are models that are like 64 billion tokens here, and they see like steep drop, even to like even 40 sequence length. So why is this happening? Because this is like a very simple task for these models to be able to do with so many parameters, but yet we see this behavior.
So what was the model training with?
So these are like lambda models that are pre-trained on text, but on fine tuning,
Like so, there is a okay.
you have a fine tuning on parity task.
Right. So
Yeah.
no, I thought like you're saying for training we have a different sequence length.
Yeah. So training here is from between 10 to 20.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the sequence length.
So what are position encoding are you?
Yeah. So we'll get to that. So these models use rotary position encodings.
And then you have to use the adjustment.
Yeah. So that's the going to be the crux of the talk on how to do that or what to do. Yeah, different ways to do it. Yeah. So we see this behavior is not specific to text. It's like also happens in arithmetic tasks, and people have demonstrated this on other kinds of tasks as well. So maybe like one natural thought comes here is like, okay, this 40 doesn't seem to be so long. Why don't you just train on longer inputs? Right? Like, why are we worried so much? We have lots of GPUs. Let's just train it on long data. Okay, so then we go back to our favorite data set, this common crawl data set, which is used to train a lot of these open source models. And then we look at its actual distribution. So here I'm plotting the word distribution of C4EN data set. So it's, if you see, like, it's like many documents in this are very short. Like median length is like 200 words. Even if we say, okay, we don't need that much long data, we only need few of them, it really doesn't have that much long data. Maximum you'll get like 8,000 tokens by 8,000 words. And like there is not much long context data in this. So people have thought about this and came up with like alternate sets. Okay, let's say we go back to archive and we download all the physics papers, which tend to have long proofs. And yeah, so we can download the LaTeX code and use that to feed our LLMs. So that helps a bit, right? Like, okay, now the median length is now much higher. It's no longer in like hundreds, it's in thousands. So, and it's like actually much nicer because it's a much longer context data set. So we went back and did this experiment. Okay, let's train on archive data set. It has median length of 7,000. So let's see if this solves our issue. So it solves our issue to an extent. So here we train up to 8,000 context length. And then again test it from all the way from 512 to 60,000, 64,000. And we again see the same behavior. Like till the training length, the model behaves well. But once we feed it longer inputs, it starts going bad, like quickly.
Why is it possible to have worse performance when the context length is smaller?
Yeah, so when it's smaller, what happens is the perplexity is higher because initial words are generally harder to predict because there's not enough context for the model. So even for these models, the perplexity for those initial tokens will be bad, but because you're averaging over a lot of tokens,
yeah, but this is an artifact.
It's an artifact because the first few tokens are the harder ones to predict. Yeah, it's just showing that behavior. Yeah, so it seems like, yeah, we run out of enough data to actually train on this very long context, like if you want actually good performance on that. So is there any other way like we can hope to not train on this like very long data because we don't have enough of it or the computation is too expensive? Yes, Sanjay.
So when you're testing on, say, really large sequence, like say 60,000,
yeah,
what kind, if you're saying every paper, no paper is really very long, then what are you actually testing?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that's the applications I showed earlier, like the new applications where you want to upload like a whole entire of your paper corpus and ask questions about it, ask it to write a new paper. Yeah, so these are relatively new applications and there is not much like this free text data that we had so far. Yeah. Yes.
So in some sense, like you're saying that the thing that you're testing on has like a different distribution than the thing that you like trained on.
Right.
So is it possible that this discrepancy is because of distribution shift rather than?
Yeah, it is partly because of that. But you can imagine like humans do well, even though we are never trained probably on very long context. Like, can be reasonably sure that we'll do well. So the question here is like, can we hope similar thing for these models? Like, do they really need to be trained on like million tokens to actually predict well on million token examples? So yeah, so that's the question we are interested in. So now let's see other issues that come up with this model. So maybe like you don't really care about long context applications. You only care about short context applications. But even then, there seems to be an issue with these models once you are in the testing like longish inputs. Like here, we are testing on like 4,000 roughly input tokens for a language model, and they're testing like very simple tasks. Like you want to ask a question and answer is one of the documents, and they just varied the position of the documents in the context. And what they noticed is this interesting behavior where if the correct answer containing document, if it is in either beginning or end, then the model tends to do much better. And if it is in the middle, then the performance drops. So it seems like the model not only suffers with longer inputs, but it also suffers where the position of the answer is in these inputs. So this makes us think like maybe there's actually wrong with the way these models are encoding the positions, right? Like it's not just that they can't generalize to longer lengths, it's even in the short lengths or in lengths that they're trained, they suffer when we change the position of the answer. And so they don't encode the position the way we want them to, or they're not robust in the way they're encoding. So let's now dive in to see how these models are encoding inputs, like what are the different ways. Okay, so this is like mostly like a recap slide. I'm sure you're all familiar with this figure from the Attention is All You Need paper describing a basic transformer block. But just to get everyone on the same page, this is what we mean by a transformer block. It has like attention layer and a feed-forward layer. And the attention layer computes this multi-head attention, which is just like 3 projections, query key value followed by a softmax. And the MLP layer is what we expect, like one hidden layer, MLP layer. And there is like skip connections and layer norms, all pretty standard. One interesting thing to note here is like all these projections, they're just projecting each input token independently. Only interaction between different input tokens happens in this attention computation matrix. So this is the only place in the architecture where different like number of tokens interact. And all the projections are independent of that. As a consequence, the number of parameters is independent of sequence length. And the model, like essentially this more part of the model doesn't know the input orderings. It's agnostic to what is the ordering of the input tokens. So yeah, so these are permutation equivariant. So they don't know what is the ordering of input tokens. So the original paper proposed this absolute position encodings to tell the model what is the ordering, like which are tokens in what position. So they proposed this sinusoidal position encoding where for each input token, once you convert it into some embedding vector, you add another vector to it depending on the position. And that vector is this sinusoidal vector with different frequencies along different dimensions. And this worked great. Initial papers, they showed like great results on challenging tasks like translation and so on. But however, if you want to test the model trained with these position encodings on lengths that are not seen during training, the model quickly falls apart because once you are adding these position encodings that are not seen during training, it's a completely new vector for the model, and the model doesn't know what to do with it. And this happens even with trainable position encodings, which are absolute. So based on this, like people have seen, okay, maybe there are like better ways to do this. So there's a proposal to use this relative position encodings. So in absolute position encodings, we add the exact position at the input level. And the relative position encoding idea is like, okay, maybe we don't care about the exact position, but we only care about what is the relative distance for each token to other tokens. So they said, okay, we'll add, like if you have a token at I, paying attention to token at j, we'll add some function of I and j to the attention before doing softmax. So there have been like a couple of ideas that people have explored, T5 being the first one, probably pushing this, or there are a couple of even earlier. Then there are like follow-up works that try to improve on it. One interesting thing is like, unlike absolute, they have some concept of length generalization. For example, in T5 paper, they say, okay, for distances larger than some certain threshold, we will always add the same bias value. And because of this, the model can handle long context, but in a limited manner. It still gets worse. And this has helped a bit, but currently LLMs do not use these kinds of relative position encodings because they have a major drawback in terms of computation. So for example, if for this T5 relative position encodings, you need to fetch like the scalars depending on your position and form this Topli's matrix, which are all not accelerator friendly operations. And because of this, these methods are fairly slow compared to absolute position encodings and have fallen out of favor in the large model world. So what is currently the most preferred choice? It's this rotary position encodings. So the idea in these encodings is also like similar to relative position. Like they also try to encode the relative distance between a query and key. But instead of adding it as a bias term, what they do is they do this intelligent thing where they rotate the query and key vectors by an angle, so that when you take the inner product, the angle will be proportional to the distance between the query and key. This is not augmentation. This is still position encoding. Yeah, you're just rotating queries and keys instead of adding like a scalar value. Yeah, and this is like an easy operation because you're just rotating queries and keys, which is easy to do, and it implements relative position encoding, which has better performance. Yeah.
Is this also done only at the first layer or at all layers?
This is done every layer, every head, same operation.
That's different from traditional position encoding, right? Because that's
Yeah.
only at the, so it's much more maybe powerful.
Yeah, so definitely. So absolute position encoding, which is done only at the beginning, generally has weaker performance to all these relative methods, which are applied at every head and every layer.
Oh, all relative ones are applied.
Yes. Yeah, so this has great performance, and it doesn't have the drawbacks of the earlier relative position encoding methods I've shown because this is accelerator friendly, and it does compute this relative bias in implicit manner. So naturally, like almost it became default choice in many of these LLMs. So does it do well on long context, right? Like, so the plot I have shown earlier, as I think as asked, actually uses this rotary position encoding. So this is the LLM that's trained with this rotary position encoding that suffers from this issue. So why is it suffering from this issue, right? Like it has the position information it needs, but it seems to suffer from this issue. So one question people have asked is like, maybe it's again this fine tuning, like out of distribution issue. Like maybe if you fine tune a bit on this long data, it will solve the problem. So that's been explored in this work from Chen et al. Last year. So it helps a bit. Like, so they take like one of these 7 billion llama models that's pre-trained on 2000 context length, which gets quickly worse outside 2000. But they said, okay, let's fine tune a bit on the long context. So then now that it doesn't blow up that badly anymore. But if you see the trend, it still gets worse. Like the perplexity starts increasing as you go to longer sequences, which we don't want. Model should actually get better. It should use the longer context effectively and get better. So it doesn't seem to fully solve the problem. So are there like other ways we can like let the model know, okay, these are longer inputs, but these are similar to the distribution we have seen, or encode the position more effectively. So if you look into the rope, like why is this happening? So we do a very simple visualization here. So what we do is we take uniform attention. So this is like a very all ones matrix, which we use to compute attention. So it's like every token is attended to each other uniformly, and we apply this rotary position encoding on it. And we visualize attention matrix. Okay, so this is the attention matrix for 8000 by 8000 sequence length. And we see like how does rope affect this uniform attention matrix. So what we see is this like very strong pattern where nearby tokens, which are along the diagonal, have like very strong attention, and the far away ones decay very sharply. There is some sinusoidal pattern, but the decay is very strong even outside the first 500 tokens. So this is the same plot, but visualizing for like one particular query, where we see like the attention is very high to the nearby tokens, but very far away tokens like get very small attention value. So this suggests that the standard way we're applying this rotary position encodings have very strong locality bias. That means that it decays attention very sharply for tokens outside certain context length.
Where does that decay come from? Because that's only rows.
Yeah, so the way rotary does is it essentially makes the vectors nearly orthogonal outside certain distance. So what you see is like very far away tokens become fairly orthogonal. And like many of the techniques are trying to actually address this issue.
But it's a periodic, like if I add a position, if the position shifts up.
Yes, it's periodic, but that period, the parameters that define that period, the default values cause this kind of behavior. So, yeah.
So I guess yeah, related question, like you didn't specify like how that theta is chosen. Right?
Yeah, so these are all default values from the Llama paper or the rotary position encoding paper.
So like does it depend on like some notion of like max sequence length?
It doesn't depend on those things, like, yeah.
So it's like they just like chose.
Yeah, they chose some values, and yeah.
I mean, so the reason I asked is because if your context length is larger, like you could get repetitions. Right? Like
Yes, you do get repetitions. That's one of the issues with this. Yeah.
So basically, like it should kind of depend on what can be the max context.
Yeah. So I think there are some recent papers trying to explore that. We can chat more. Yeah. Offline. Yeah. So yeah, maybe like from what we have seen, like if you want to design like a new position encoding approach, like what are some nice properties it should have? Like one is it should not just fall apart for positions that it doesn't see during training, like absolute position encoding. So you should have some mechanism to handle the new positions well. And second thing, perhaps that would be nicer, is to have ability to learn different patterns instead of learning like this very locality biased pattern that's applies similarly for all attention layers and heads. Because if you want to handle long context, the model should be able to attend to far away tokens and retrieve relevant information. So we need to let the model to have this ability to learn like task dependent attention patterns. So yeah, so we have like two suggestions to make this position encoding have these both properties. The first idea is the interpolation idea. So what we say is, instead of using the exact relative distance between query A and position J, we will use a form of normalized distance. So for a query I, instead of using distance I minus j, we'll use I minus j divided by I. So what are nice things about this? Now the distance is no longer unbounded. So for any value of I and j for causal setting, this value will always be between 0 and 1. So we don't have to worry about, okay, can the model handle this unseen position value, because it's always in the same range with whatever training length you do. But it also has a downside that since we no longer have the exact position, exact distance, it relies on only ordering of the inputs. So you may argue that it's enough for text, or you may have like some particular applications like where exact distance matters. So that's like one of the drawback for this. But for text, you may argue that, okay, this is enough. Just having the relative ordering of tokens, not knowing the exact distance, is enough for the model. And maybe like if you have applications where exact distance matters, but only for certain tokens. And in general, what we notice is that exact distance matters only for tokens in like a very short context window. So to handle those settings, we have just augmented this to give like exact distance values for like first L tokens, and use this like interpolation for tokens beyond that. So this comes mainly from like experiments on short sequence length data. So okay, so based on this, we propose this method which we call like functional interpolation. And the idea is, first idea, as I've said, is just to use interpolation distances instead of using exact relative distances. And the second one is, instead of having a fixed locality bias, we said, okay, let the model figure out what bias it needs. And for that, we just go the deep learning way of just using a trainable MLP layer here. So instead of saying the biases should decay in a sinusoidal manner with certain frequency, we let just the model learn what the decay pattern should be. And for that, we use this like very simple function, which is just a simple small MLP layer. So we go back to the relative bias setting. but we let it learn like a trainable bias with this interpolation. So that's like the changes we make. And yeah, we just refer to this as fire. So let's see how well this will do. Yeah.
So this small network app, it's not data dependent. It's only uses the positional.
Yes. Yeah. So that's the input to that. Yeah.
You just mentioned that this kind of architecture is expensive.
It's expensive. Yes.
You have some way to-
So it is expensive. We'll discuss some tricks to make it more efficient. But you can think of this as trying to see what's the best interpolation we can achieve for these networks. Yeah. Yeah, so it satisfies our criteria, two criteria. It also has some nice theoretical properties in that it can express many of the popular position encoding methods like T-file relative or alibi efficiently without requiring a lot of parameters. So you can hope that it will learn all the useful inductive biases that people have come up with over the years and adapt to the given task at hand. So the first experiment I show here is again the same C4 language model. Again, trained at 2000, but tested from 512 to 8000. And the baseline, I think the rope is, I think this greenish blue curve. We also have like other position encoding methods that are popular to compare. And what we notice is that proposed method is like able to handle unseen range as well due to the interpolation. And it's able to at least not blow up for like at least till 8000 sequence length we tested here. Yeah.
So is there a baseline where you have tried multiple sequence length chaining and showing that it also works or fails?
Yeah, so that's the plot from fine tuning I have shown earlier. That's tried in earlier works. Yeah, so that's one of the baselines that's tried in earlier work. So we're comparing to the things they improved over it. Yeah, so this seems to at least handle till 8000 sequence length, but maybe like as one of the questions earlier, maybe it's only able to do it with perplexity. Is it actually able to do well on downstream tasks as well or not? So to test that, this.
So you have this F of I and J.
Yes.
But do you also have trainable position encodings at the input, or you don't have that anymore?
Yeah, we don't have that.
So there is no position encoding at the input. The only
Yeah.
position is this.
So in all of these methods, yeah, there is no absolute position encoding at the inputs. Yeah. In fact, having that seems to hurt. I don't know why. Yeah. Yeah. So to see if this actually solves our problem, like is it actually learning something that's better than, or not just locality bias, but also other patterns, we visualize the learned position biases from different layers for a particular head with this approach. And what we plot here is like for a particular token, how does the attention bias, like fire bias, decay? And what we see is like many of the curves show the locality bias. Like for example, this green curve has very strong locality bias. It pays only attention to nearby tokens. But we also see like some heads that learn the opposite bias. So for example, one of the head, like brownish head or orange head here, they actually learn opposite patterns where they pay more attention to faraway tokens. So model is actually finding it useful to learn not just locality bias, but also like this anti-locality bias in different heads of the layer. So we believe this also gives the model like more expressive power than like always constraining to be the same locality bias in all heads. So next we evaluated this model on this long context benchmark called Scrolls, which has all the way to like 60,000. And it has like bunch of summarization tasks, question answering tasks. And what we see is that the model consistently improves not just over rope, but also it's like position interpolation versions, which came up in the follow-up papers. And on an average, it seems to get like nice improvements on these benchmarks for both. Like we test two size models here. Base is like 100 million, large is like 300 million model size models. We also test like zero-shot generalization on narrative QA tasks. So here we take a model that's fine-tuned with 8,000 context length, but test it from like 512 to 32K context length. And we again see like performance of like this interpolation approach is consistently above, whereas standard approaches like rope suffer significantly outside the training context length. With interpolation, it helps a bit, but it's very sensitive to the interpolated value. So yeah, as we have discussed earlier, like these kinds of relative position encoding methods, they are very expensive compared to something like rope. So in terms of computation, it's still advantageous to apply like rotary position encoding style methods. So to reduce the computational cost of these approaches, we experimented with sharing this method across layers. So instead of having like separate trainable version for each layer, we just share, like compute it once for the first layer and share it across layers. So this does reduce quality a bit. We see like minimal quality loss on both perplexity and downstream tasks like scrolls. But we see like much better inference efficiency times, like almost comparable to like rope here. For example, here inference times, it's comparable to rope or no position encoding. Whereas in terms of accuracies on downstream tasks, the loss is not as bad as like rotary position encoding or other methods. So this is one way you can like try to manage the computational cost. There are more tricks you can apply, but yeah, that's will be like specific to your task. But this simple like shared across layers seems to be sufficient. Yes. Yeah, so this is the eval where we tried it up to 32K context length. Oh, shared version. We have tried it. I don't think we have the results here, but I can, yeah, send them to you offline. Yeah. Yeah, so this seems to like bridge the gap. And finally, another thing we did is to do a sanity check to see if doing this long context interpolation, does it hurt short context tasks? Because that's the behavior we see in some of these interpolation approaches, that when you try to tune the model to do well on long context length, it hurts on like shorter sequence length tasks. So here we evaluated the models on the standard glue and super glue benchmarks, which use up to like 1000 context length. And we see that the FIRE approach is like competitive with rope and other methods that are strong on this like long short sequence benchmark. Yeah. So maybe like now the question is like, is it a solved problem or are there like open challenges? So I think this is like far from solved. Like we came up with like one particular way that we can train these models, but in general, the question of long context generalization doesn't have like a good framework to ask like, is there a lower bound on sequence length? Like, can I train transformers with, I don't know, 128 tokens or 512 tokens and expect it to work well on 10 million? What are the data properties or distributional properties that affect that? Position encoding is only like one part of the picture, but we didn't touch data which has important effects like we saw in the lost in the middle setting. So what is like Oracle lower bound we can get on shorter sequence length? We can train these models. Or for example, if you have enough data and compute and train a really long context model, how does that perform versus this interpolation kind of techniques? So we don't know answer to many of these questions. Like we don't know what are the upper bounds and lower bounds are. So that will be like interesting to study this more formally and yeah, come up with like even better approaches. There is also like interest in like reducing the training and inference costs as we discussed in the beginning. So there have been a lot of efficient attention approaches that have been proposed in the literature. We don't know how they behave in this context, like do they generalize well or what is their interaction with these different position encoding methods. It's not studied well. So that can also be like a interesting area of study. Yeah. So yeah. I also have like some slides to discuss tree former work, but I don't know if for like more discussion or
We have about 5
okay.
minutes left.
Okay.
I don't know how many slides you have.
Okay, I can like give like a very high level overview of our sparse attention or tree former work, trying to address the training efficiency part. So yeah, so this is just a recap of what we discussed in the beginning. So for long sequences, transformers, attention becomes a bottleneck with like quadratic computational cost on the sequence length. So there have been like some techniques that have been like very promising, like this big bird. There have been like some theoretically motivated techniques like performer trying to do approximate softmax using kernels. And they are all evaluated on this like LRA benchmark, which is a synthetic benchmark for long sequence data. And what we are plotting here on x-axis is like the computational cost or flops, and y-axis is the average score. So higher is better. So ideally, you want a model that's on the left and the top, so that it has low cost but high performance. Standard transformer is like here, like some very simple kernel approximations, linear approximations do well in terms of compute, but fall in the average score. Ideally, you want a model like Big Bird or somewhere close here, which has like good computational cost as well as LRS score. The question we look at it is that the optimal thing? Can we do like improve on its performance? So we propose this tree former architecture, essentially using as the decision trees as a retrieval mechanism for self-attention. And with this, we are able to like improve upon Big Bird style architectures. Like for example, this TCA gets like a much better savings in computational cost for the same score. So I will briefly introduce this architecture, like what is this tree former and how we use decision trees, and what are the challenges in using decision trees with neural networks, because these discrete objects don't train well with standard gradient design. Okay, so
What is this thing here? Isn't the training efficiency, the inference efficiency, like what is
this is looking at inference cost. Yeah, so if you recall the standard attention, we are doing essentially like this query key inner products and applying a softmax. And you can see this as a nearest neighbor search, because softmax essentially makes these inner products fairly sparse. So for each query, all attention layer is doing is retrieving doing a nearest neighbor search. So a natural question here is like, if you have like very long sequences, can we do this nearest neighbor search efficiently? So there's been like a lot of works in the literature on how to do like efficient nearest neighbor search. In one particular mechanism is using this decision trees, which do like high dimensional clustering efficiently. So with okay, let's try to see how to integrate this into the attention layer. But what is the main challenge? Because decision trees are like fairly discrete objects, and they don't integrate well with like neural networks. For example, they don't optimize well with SGD kind of settings. So what we suggest in this work is finding a way to integrate them with neural networks. In particular, what we do is a way to start with the attention model and bootstrap slowly decision tree layers into the attention model. So instead of doing a training from scratch, we train like a standard attention layer first and use that to warm start decision trees, thereby going around the optimization issues of the standard decision tree and finding like a good start for these models. So one work that we build a lot on this work by Karthikeyan et al., where they suggested using this dense gradient trees. I would not go into what are the specific variants, but you can think of this as like very simple decision trees with modifications to make them slightly more friendly to backprop. So I'll just mention like maybe this slide here. So the idea is very simple. So this is the standard attention, where we are computing attention over all the keys and values. In this setup, one main difference is we have this S bar set, where we are saying, okay, instead of computing attention between all keys and values, only compute attention in this set S bar. So how this set S bar is computed is using this decision trees. Like, so we map all the queries and keys using the decision trees into these leaf nodes, and we only pay attention for queries that are in the same leaf node as the keys. So if Q falls in like a particular leaf node, we only grab queries from that, and that's this set S bar. So it's a very simple idea, and it leads to like significant reduction in both computational and memory for attention. Yeah, so this is just an illustration of how we are computing this partition of queries and keys into different leaf nodes. This is very similar to standard decision trees, where at each node we have to make a binary decision based on a linear projection followed by sigmoid on which part of the tree the given query or key should go into. And finally, once we determine which key a query belongs, then we just compute attention between those. So in the interest of time, I'll just show like results on BERT. Yeah.
What these approaches which are going down from quadratic to linear or near linear.
Yes.
This is the kind of thing that subselect as a you hard quantum.
So there are like multiple approaches. One is selection based, using like hashing or clustering. There are others which are more based on some form of compression, where they try to compress a bunch of context into like a single vector. Yeah. So yeah, in BERT setup, we tested this and compared with the state of the art then, which was Big BERT, and we are able to notice like a similar performance at a significant reduction in computational cost. Yeah, testing this at larger models is like an ongoing work. Yeah. Yes.
So do you need to do this in training for it to be effective in
Yeah.
inference, or
Yeah.
can I take a pre-trained model and just do some?
So we can do this, like you don't need same compute as full training, but you need to do some tuning at least.
No, but it has to be involved in training also.
It has to be involved in part of training. Yeah. Yes.
There's a question on YouTube.
Okay. Oh. Okay.
Atlas is from your- Have you seen any special way to grow context length expert model?
So mixture of experts usually applies in the MLP layer. So I don't think that should affect these techniques, or at least I'm not aware of if it affecting like these attention layers.
Can I just speak to clarify my question?
Okay.
Am I heard? I don't know if you could hear me well.
You want to say yes?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So the reason I'm asking this is I was wondering if you have seen any work which use yes I understand the mixture expert applied to MLP. I work on it myself too. So mixture expert, have you seen any work try to use mixture of expert to divide the context windows and try to all maybe more straightforward use it in a mix of attention way to divide the context windows? The closest thing I have ever seen is the landmark attention from Martin Jackie last year.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not familiar with any works like that that try to divide, input lengths into like different attention heads. Or that sounds like a good direction.
Okay, so let me be straight. The reason I was reminded to ask this is because I see the good release from your company, that model who has 10 million tokens yesterday, and it was claimed to be a mixture of expert. I just want to know whether there's some connection in between the two facts.
Yeah, I don't think so. But,
okay, that's a good answer to know. Thank you.
Yeah, I think with this slide, maybe I'll just conclude the talk. Thanks.
Okay. We have several questions in the in the thing, so I think we can disperse. And if you have questions, maybe